This week, we cover the third and final in our series of the Victoria Cross recipients from Norwich during the First World War. Ernest Seaman was born on the 16th of August 1893 in 9 Derby Street, Hingham, near Norwich, to Henry and Sarah Seaman. He was the youngest of 9 children, 7 boys and 2 girls. He attended his local Church of England school for the first few years of his life, but sadly, his father was to die when he was very young. His mother would go on to remarry a man named Edward Palmer, landlord of the public house The King's Head in the village of Scole on the Norfolk-Suffolk border. He also ran a taxi service, collecting passengers from the nearby Diss railway station using a horse and cart. With the family's move to Scole, Ernest switched schools to the Scole Council School, where he was described as generally unremarkable in class. He was neither a scholar or a sportsman, reserved and quiet, but also gentlemanly and kind. Possibly, he was a little on the large side for this time period, as he is physically described as plumpish. While there, he would also gain the nickname Peddler, but in later life he tended to go by Ernie. Ernest's education came to an end age 14, nothing unusual for this time period, especially for working and lower middle class children, who were needed at work rather than in the classroom, with many even having to split their childhoods between working and attending school, sometimes in terrible conditions. Follow the link on screen to my presentation on the Burston Strike School for more information about this. To begin with, Ernest worked a series of small jobs to earn some money, before he moved to Timbley in Suffolk to live with his aunt, after getting a job as a page boy in the Grand Hotel in the nearby port town of Felixstowe. During this time, he also held jobs as a ship's steward on the P&O liners sailing from Britain to India, and as a waiter/billiard maker in the Gentlemen's Club, the Cocoa Tree Club, and St James's Street in Piccadilly. In 1912, it is said that in search of a better life, he packed his bags and emigrated to Canada. But this is disputed, as there seems to be no real details to corroborate this. Even if this is true, he wouldn't be in Canada for very long. In the summer of 1914, the First World War broke out, and soon, from all corners of the empire, men were rallying to the flag of what they saw as the mother country. When it came his time to enlist, Sidney didn't join the Canadian Army, if he was even there. Instead, he sailed back to Britain. He arrived back in the country in 1915. On his first attempt to enlist, he was turned down, labelled medically unfit for service due to his physical condition. But Ernest was determined to join. He tried again later in 1915, and this time was accepted, but not for a role in the front line. He arrived in France in the final days of 1915, landing in Le Havre as a member of the Army Service Corps, where he worked in the kitchens as a baker. As far as Ernest knew, this was going to be his war, spent in kitchens and mess halls, with the only real danger coming from a possible long-range artillery shell. Certainly a position that many would describe as having a good war, but this was not to be. After the staggering losses of 1915 to 1917 at Loos, Gallipoli, the Somme, the Messines, Passchendaele, and not to mention elsewhere in the world where the Great War was raging, the siege of Kut alone in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, had led to 23,000 British and Indian troops killed or wounded, and 13,164 captured when the town fell to the Ottoman Empire in April of 1916. With the casualty figures rising and new recruits simply not being turned out fast enough, conscription had been established in Britain for the first time on the 27th of January 1916. And now, within the forces, standards were being lowered. Many of those serving in support roles were to be reassessed fit to fight. Among them was Ernest. He was re-examined and determined fit for infantry service, and assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers as a Lewis gunner, a regiment hailing from Omagh in Northern Ireland. His transfer was only to be for the duration of the war. After this, he was meant to rejoin the Army Service Corps. Throughout 1918, Ernest saw action with the Enniskillens, who were part of the 109th Brigade of the 36th Ulster Division, originally formed pre-war of Irish loyalists to combat the growing threat of Irish nationalism to British rule over the country. Many of its members must have made strange company for a quiet man from Norfolk. But as a fighting division, the 36th had proved themselves time and time again in battle, most famously during the Battle of the Somme. Possibly it was due to the lofty reputation of this division, or the need to not be the odd man out, both in being an Englishman and a man from the rear echelon assigned to infantry. But Ernest threw himself into his new role as an infantryman. As they fought in the Ypres salient during the difficult days of the German spring offensive, through the summer and the black day of the German army on the 8th of August 1918, and into the final 100 days, he was a steadfast member of his regiment, and there was even talk that he should be awarded the military medal for attending to a wounded comrade under fire, as well as his general attitude and devotion to duty. There is some debate on whether he received an MM. He was certainly put forward for one, as you will see later, but there seems to be no official statement that the one was ever granted. Despite this, he is often credited with the MM next to his name on websites. It was on the 29th of September 1918, and now Lance Corporal Seaman and the rest of A Company were on the attack, pushing German forces from the village of Terhand north of the infamous Menin Road, near the town of Ypres, during what is known as the Fifth Battle of Ypres, an area that had seen heavy fighting since the 19th of October 1914. The battle itself had started the day before, and although it was fought over the old Passchendaele battlefield from the year before, it was going to prove to be nothing like the same old slog. 6,000 yards of ground were captured in the first day alone, far from an easy feat in such conditions. The 36th joined the fight the next day. For many involved, this was their first time they had fought a war on open ground, having left the trenches and no man's land now behind them. The fight was now for ditches, hedgerows, and buildings. The German troops stationed in Terhand put up a determined defence, especially on the sector that had been tasked to A Company to capture. And soon, despite determined efforts, the right flank of Ernest's company was being held up by heavy machine gun fire. An attack that had started with so much promise for the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers at 9:30 that morning was now being slowed and brought to a grinding halt like so many attacks before it. In the face of withering machine gun fire, men fell or took cover. Something had to be done. It was Lance Corporal Ernest Seaman, a position which he had held for just 14 days, who took the initiative, and rushed forward alone, somehow missed by the burst of machine guns, and opened fire on the machine guns' positions with his Lewis gun, single-handedly killing an officer and 2 men, and capturing 12 prisoners. An incredible act of bravery, but it would prove not to be a one-off. Later that day, he would repeat his lone charge on another machine gun nest, once again capturing it. Sadly, his luck was not to last, and it was moments after he'd captured his second nest he was killed, aged 25. The Fifth Battle of Ypres would be a victory for the Allies, pushing the Germans from the area and taking 10,000 prisoners. The advance of A Company of the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, and the ability to capture their objectives was put entirely down to the actions of Ernest by his commanding officer. Ernest's body was never recovered from the battlefield where he fell. He was one of the many killed in a war with less than 6 weeks left to run. His name is inscribed on the Tyncott Memorial to the Missing, along with 8,368 others that can be found in Tyncott Cemetery, near the town of Ypres. His name is on panel 70. A Company's commanding officer, Captain V.E.S. Maddox, knew he should be recognised for his bravery that day, and was keen to put him forward for an award. He was one of the best soldiers whom I had ever met. An excellent soldier in every sense of the word. He was very keen to his duties and always volunteered to help in any extra work that had to be done, no matter how dangerous or difficult. For his constant devotion to duty and gallantry in volunteering to attend wounded colleagues under heavy fire, I recommend his being awarded the military medal. It was as the request for a decoration moved up the chain of command, it was decided that the military medal was not enough for what he had done, and it was to be upgraded to the Victoria Cross. The citation for his VC was published in the London Gazette on the 12th of November 1918, the day after the guns fell silent, for most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty. When the right flank of his company was held up by a nest of enemy machine guns, he, with great courage and initiative, rushed forward under heavy fire with his Lewis gun, gauged the position single-handed, capturing 2 machine guns and 12 prisoners, killing 1 officer and 2 men. Later in the day, he again rushed another machine gun position, capturing the gun under heavy fire. He was killed immediately afterwards. His courage and dash were beyond all praise, and it was entirely due to the very gallant conduct of Lance Corporal Seaman that his company was enabled to push forward to its objective and capture many prisoners. His Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously to him, presented to his mother on the 13th of February 1919, personally, by King George V at Buckingham Palace. It was the 1101st Victoria Cross to be awarded. Other than in the previously mentioned Tynecott, Ernest Seaman is remembered on the VC Memorial Stone at Ulster Tower near Teep Val on the Somme. In Suffolk, his name is inscribed on the Felixstowe War Memorial, and in Norfolk, his name can be found on the Skull War Memorial and St Andrew's Church in Skull. He also has a street named after him in that village, as well as several memorials across Northern Ireland connected to the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers and the 36th Division. And of course, like the other two covered in this series, a memorial paving slab was laid for him at Norwich War Memorial on St Peter's Street. Unveiled on the 29th of September 2018, 100 years after his death, by the Mayor and Archdeacon of Norwich, as well as some of his descendants. A service was also held in the village of Skull in his honour. Ernest was also the subject of a short story called Unfit for Active Service by Ruth Dougal. It was published in 2018 and was part of an anthology covering stories from all over Europe, known as The Many Faces of 1918. His medals: the Victoria Cross, the 1914-15 Star, a medal that he only just qualified for due to the date he joined and arrived in France, the British War Medal, and the Allied Victory Medal, can be found in the Royal Logistics Corps Museum, the Royal Logistic Corps being a successor of the Army Service Corps in which Ernest served. The Victoria Cross on display here is only a copy, with the original being kept in a bank vault for safety. As a man killed in action, along with his medals, his family would have also received a memorial plaque known as a dead man's penny, but have been unable to find any information on the location of Ernest's one. This marks the end of our little three-part series covering the Victoria recipients from Norwich for the First World War. Thank you for indulging me in this. Next week's presentation will be on something a little bit more light-hearted, I promise. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was Norwich's Victoria Cross Heroes, Ernest Seaman, and this was a little bit of history.